The wind carried dust across the plains, dry and restless as though the land itself whispered judgment upon newcomers. Wagons creaked along the rough trail that led into Durango, Colorado, each wheel cutting grooves into the hardened earth. Among them sat Clara May Johnson, her figure broad and tall upon the bench, her hands gripping the reins of the mule team with practiced steadiness. Years of hard labor had carved strength into her body, a strength many did not understand, much less respect. Clara's daughter, Rose, perched beside her, hair pulled back into a simple braid. At just 15, she had already learned how to read people's stares. She saw the way their eyes lingered on her mother, some wide with curiosity, others narrowed with disdain. Rose's young heart burned with a quiet fury each time she heard whispers that her mama was too large, too unfeminine, not fit for the delicate image frontier society often demanded of women. The town of Durango sprawled before them, its main street lined with false front buildings, a saloon with swinging doors, a church with a pointed steeple, a general store with its windows full of dry goods. The smell of horses, wood smoke, and stale whiskey drifted in the air. Men leaned against railings, their hats tipped low, while women in calico dresses exchanged murmurs at the sight of Clara driving her wagon into town. This was a place where strength was needed, yet judged harshly when it appeared in the wrong form. And Clara, despite her dignity, knew she would be measured not by her honesty or toil, but by how she looked compared to the narrow mold set by others. Before we walk with Clara into this story of courage, judgment, and resilience, let me pause for a moment. If you enjoy tales of ordinary people tested by extraordinary circumstances, of resilience in times when the odds were stacked high, I invite you to subscribe to the channel now. Your support allows us to keep bringing stories like this one, stories that remind us of the grit that shaped lives on the frontier. The wagon slowed as Clara drew it to a stop before the livery stable. She climbed down, her boots striking the packed dirt. Her height made her stand nearly eye to eye with most men, her shoulders wide from years of chopping wood and hauling water. She was not delicate, not dainty, but she carried herself with a quiet grace. Rose followed, glancing warily at a group of cowhands who had paused their laughter to gape. "Don't mind them," Clara murmured to her daughter, though the sting of their stares pressed heavy against her chest. "Eyes get tired of the same thing out here. New folks are always a sight." Rose tightened her grip on her mother's hand. "They're not staring because you're new. They're staring because they don't know what real strength looks like." Clara gave her a small smile, though sadness lingered in her eyes. She had heard the laughter before, in other towns, on other roads. She had felt the weight of being different her whole life. But it was Rose's pride that steadied her now. Inside the livery, the smell of hay and manure filled the air. The stableman, wiry and grey-haired, lifted a brow as Clara entered. "That your team outside?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Need 'em fed and rested. They've pulled near 100 miles without pause," Clara answered. The man studied her, his eyes flicking from her calloused hands to her broad frame. "Don't see many women handling a rig like that." Clara met his gaze evenly. "Don't see many men who can keep a team running in dry heat without breaking them." For a moment silence hung between them, then the stableman gave a short nod. "Fair enough, 5 cents a head. They'll be tended proper." Rose watched with quiet triumph as her mother settled the matter without flinching. She wished the rest of the world could see what she saw, not a figure to mock, but a woman who had endured storms, loneliness, and the grind of frontier life with unshakable resolve. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across Durango's streets. Clara knew she would need to find work, a roof, and a place for Rose to belong. Yet beneath it all a question pressed in her mind. Would this town ever allow her to be more than a target of whispers? She gathered her daughter close and walked back toward the wagon, her heart steady but cautious, unaware that this place, like so many before, would soon test every ounce of her strength. Durango pulsed with the rhythm of the frontier, its streets alive with the mingling sounds of hooves striking dirt, wagons rattling over uneven boards, and the faint jingle of spurs echoing from passing riders. The smell of tobacco smoke and frying bacon drifted from the saloon, while the church bell rang faintly at the far end of town, a reminder that life here balanced sin and salvation in equal measure. Clara May Johnson took it all in, her gaze steady, her lips pressed into a line that revealed neither excitement nor fear. Rose walked at her side, her eyes darting quickly from one storefront to the next. She noticed everything, the women with lace gloves who whispered behind parasols, the children chasing each other with sticks, the men whose stares lingered too long on her mother's shoulders. Rose hated the way their mouths curled, amused by something that only they seemed to find funny. "Don't look at them," Clara murmured, her voice calm though her pulse quickened. "We didn't come here for their approval." "I don't care about their approval," Rose whispered back. "I care about their disrespect." The two entered the general store, where rows of shelves groaned beneath sacks of flour, tins of coffee, and bolts of calico cloth. Behind the counter stood a stout man with a red face and thinning hair. He looked Clara up and down before forcing a smile. "Afternoon, ma'am. Afternoon, miss. What'll it be?" "Flour, beans, salt pork if you have it," Clara said evenly. The man fetched the items, though not before muttering something under his breath that made two cowhands near the barrel of pickles snicker. One nudged the other, nodding toward Clara. "Big as an ox, ain't she? Must take 2 chairs at supper." Rose froze, her fists clenching at her sides. Clara heard every word, but kept her chin high. She placed the coins on the counter, ignoring the cowhand's laughter that grew louder as she hefted the sack of flour onto her shoulder with ease. Rose's voice trembled with anger. "Mama—" "Not here," Clara cut her off softly, though her eyes flickered with hurt. "Let's be about our business." Outside, the street seemed heavier with judgment. Clara led Rose toward the inn, a modest building with lace curtains fluttering in the windows. The innkeeper, Mrs. Whitfield, greeted them with a cautious smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Looking for a room?" she asked. "For now, just a hot meal," Clara replied. Mrs. Whitfield's gaze lingered on Clara's frame before she nodded toward an empty table. "Sit where you like." They ate quietly, though whispers circled like vultures. A woman at a nearby table leaned toward her companion. "Can't imagine a man ever finding her suitable." The words pricked at Clara, but she focused on her plate, cutting the bread with deliberate calm. Rose's cheeks flushed red, her jaw set with defiance. As the meal ended, Clara asked Mrs. Whitfield about work. The woman hesitated, then said, "The blacksmith's been needing an extra pair of hands." "Hard labor, though." Her eyes scanned Clara again as if measuring her worth in muscle rather than dignity. Clara nodded. "Thank you. Work's what I came for." The sun had dipped lower, casting an orange glow across the mountains that rose like watchful sentinels around Durango. Clara and Rose walked back toward their wagon, the weight of stares following every step. Rose finally broke the silence. "Why do you let them talk that way? You don't deserve it." Clara placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, her voice quiet but firm. "Because words can't plow a field, nor can they feed us through winter. Let them waste their breath. We'll prove ourselves by what we do, not by answering their cruelty." Rose nodded, though her chest still burned with indignation. She knew her mother's strength wasn't just in her arms, it was in her restraint. But deep inside, she wished the world would see it too. As twilight deepened, the lanterns of Durango flickered to life. Clara lifted her gaze toward the distant mountains, steady and unyielding. In that moment, she silently vowed to carve a place in this town, no matter how many whispers rose against her. Morning came crisp and cool, the mountains painted in soft hues of blue and gold as the sun rose over Durango. Clara adjusted her shawl against the chill and guided Rose toward the general store. Supplies were running low, and she hoped another trip inside might pass without the same sting of ridicule they had endured before. Yet her heart carried the weight of expectation, braced against disappointment. The store was busy that morning. Wagons lined the street, and the sound of spurs clinking on wooden steps echoed as cowhands and ranchers bustled in and out. Clara pushed open the door, Rose close behind, and immediately the smell of kerosene, leather, and cured meats filled the air. She walked with steady purpose to the counter, but it didn't take long for whispers to stir. Two young cowhands near the barrel of sugar exchanged a grin when they saw her. One, lanky and loose-limbed, let out a laugh that cut through the murmur of voices. "Looky there," he said loudly enough for half the store to hear. A mountain come down to buy sugar. Better make sure there's enough left for the rest of us. Laughter rippled around them, sharp and careless. Clara's face remained composed, but the words struck deep. Rose stiffened, her fists clenching as though she might throw a punch then and there. "Don't," Clara whispered firmly, sensing her daughter's brewing anger. "We walk out with what we came for. Nothing more, nothing less." But the second cowhand wasn't finished. He leaned against the counter, eyes dancing with mockery. "Reckon she could pull the plow better than my mule. Big as she is, she might just drag the wagon too." More laughter followed, louder this time. The storekeeper said nothing, pretending to rearrange tins of coffee as though the moment didn't exist. Clara's chest tightened, but she refused to let them see her break. She placed her order calmly, her voice even, though her cheeks burned with humiliation. Rose, however, could not keep silent. Her voice rang clear, cutting through the jeers. "She's stronger than 10 of you put together, and none of you would last a day in her shoes." The room grew still for a heartbeat, surprised at the boldness of a girl so young. Clara turned sharply to her daughter, her eyes a mixture of pride and worry. She didn't want Rose to bear the burden of her battles, but she couldn't deny the fire in her words. The cowhands only smirked. "Fiery little thing, ain't she? Just like her mama, too much and not enough all at once." Rose opened her mouth to retort, but a new voice cut in, calm yet edged with steel. "That's enough." The words came from a man standing near the back of the store, tall and broad, with a weathered face framed by a dark beard streaked with grey. His buckskin coat and wide-brimmed hat marked him as a man of the mountains, a figure out of place among the polished boots and pressed shirts of town. The room quieted. Everyone knew him. Samuel Hawk Dawson, the trapper who lived deep in the Rockies and came to town only when he needed supplies. His reputation carried weight. Stories of his survival in blizzards and his skill with rifle and knife were told in hushed tones around campfires. The cowhands shifted uneasily under his steady gaze. "Just foolin', Hawk," one mumbled, his earlier bravado fading. "Didn't sound like foolin' to me," Hawk replied, his voice low but sharp as a blade. He didn't look at Clara directly, but his presence alone shifted the air, pressing the mockers into silence. Clara finished paying, her hands steady, though her heart beat hard against her ribs. She nodded once in Hawk's direction, a silent acknowledgement of his intervention, before leading Rose toward the door. As they stepped into the sunlight, Rose's eyes shone with both anger and admiration. "Mama, you shouldn't let them talk like that." Clara's voice was soft but resolute. "We'll show them who we are by living, not by shouting." Yet in her chest, a spark of curiosity stirred. Who was this mountain man who had spoken up when no one else dared? Sunday morning dawned bright over Durango, the sky a vast stretch of pale blue framed by the jagged peaks of the Rockies. Church bells rang out, summoning townsfolk from every corner. Clara adjusted the simple bonnet on her head, smoothing her daughter's braid before they walked up the dirt path that led to the small white church. Rose's hand clutched hers tightly, as if preparing for another round of stares and whispers. Inside, the pews filled quickly, the air thick with perfume, dust, and anticipation. Families greeted one another with nods and polite smiles, though more than a few eyes lingered on Clara as she entered. She felt the weight of their scrutiny, but kept her back straight and her steps steady. Rose, however, scanned the faces with open defiance, daring anyone to laugh. The sermon began, Pastor Edwards's voice booming about humility and kindness. Yet as his words echoed, a group of women seated near the front exchanged whispers that carried farther than they realized. "Such a size for a woman," one muttered. "No wonder she's alone." "Poor child," another whispered, eyes flicking toward Rose. "To grow up with a mother like that." The words stung like nettles. Clara's jaw tightened, but she fixed her gaze on the pulpit, determined not to falter. Rose, however, could not contain the fire that rose in her chest. She stood abruptly, her voice clear and strong, slicing through the murmurs. "That's my mama you're talking about," she declared, her cheeks flushed with both anger and pride. "And she's worth more than all your gossip put together." The church fell silent. Heads turned shocked at the boldness of a young girl challenging women twice her age. Pastor Edwards paused mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing as he gauged the room. Clara reached for her daughter's hand, whispering urgently, "Sit down, Rose, please." But Rose's chin lifted higher. "I won't let them mock you, Mama. You work harder than any man in this town. You've given me everything, and I'll not sit quiet while they speak lies." The silence deepened, uncomfortable, as the congregation shifted in their seats. Some looked away, ashamed. Others stiffened, unwilling to acknowledge the truth in Rose's words. Finally, Pastor Edwards cleared his throat and spoke with a gentleness that surprised Clara. "Child, respect for one's mother is a virtue, and courage to defend what is right is no sin. Perhaps we should all remember the measure of a person is not in outward appearance, but in the life they live before God and neighbor." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, though not all faces softened. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, not from shame but from the fierce love of her daughter, who refused to let her stand alone. After the service, as families spilled onto the church steps, the air buzzed with hushed conversations. Some avoided Clara altogether, others offered half-hearted greetings, but a few gave nods of quiet respect. Rose stood tall at her mother's side, her small shoulders squared as if daring anyone to speak again. Clara knelt slightly, her voice low but firm. "Rose, you mustn't fight every battle for me. It isn't your burden to carry." Rose shook her head, her eyes shining with determination. "It is my burden, Mama, because you're mine. You've carried me through storms and winters, and every hard mile we've walked. If they laugh, let them, but I'll never let them forget who you are to me." Clara's heart swelled with both pride and sorrow. She pulled her daughter close, her strong arms wrapping around her slender frame. "You're braver than I ever was at your age," she whispered. "But remember, sometimes silence is its own strength." Rose rested her head against her mother's shoulder. "Maybe, but sometimes a voice needs to be heard." As they walked away from the church, Clara felt the shift in the air. Though whispers still followed, so too did curious glances. Some filled with doubt, others with newfound respect. And in the shadow of the mountains, Samuel Hawk Dawson watched from a distance, his eyes narrowing with interest at the bold young girl who had spoken with such fire, and at the mother she so fiercely defended. The following days passed with a heavy stillness that Clara could not shake. Whispers clung to her like burrs on wool, and though she worked with quiet determination, the sting of ridicule lingered. Rose remained defiant, walking at her mother's side with her chin high, daring anyone to speak. Yet Clara knew that fire could only burn for so long before it left scars. One late afternoon, as the sun sank low and painted the mountains in amber light, Clara carried a bundle of laundry from the creek back toward their wagon. Her arms, strong from years of labor, bore the weight easily, though her spirit was weary. She noticed him then, Hawk Dawson, leaning against the hitching post near the general store, a coil of rawhide rope slung over one shoulder. He watched her without mockery, his weathered face unreadable. After a long moment he stepped forward, his boots crunching against the dirt. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice steady, carrying the cadence of a man used to silence more than speech. Clara paused, cautious. "Yes, sir? You've got strength most men in this town wouldn't know what to do with." His gaze lingered on the laundry bundle, then lifted to meet her eyes. "They see it as something to laugh at. I see it as something useful." Clara's brow furrowed. "Useful? I've got leather needing to be worked, hides needing scraped, and supplies to be put up. My daughter and I can manage, but another pair of capable hands would make the load lighter." He shifted his stance, his voice even. "Pay would be fair. Work's honest." Rose, who had been trailing a step behind, brightened instantly. "Mama, that's good work. You could show them all." Clara's eyes softened at her daughter's eagerness, but doubt tugged at her chest. She knew what people would say. "If I take this work, there'll be talk. They already call me a mule. Working for you will only feed the fire." Hawk's gaze didn't waver. "Let 'em talk. Talk won't split wood or mend boots. Only thing that matters is whether you want the work." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the rattle of a wagon passing down the street. Clara studied him, This mountain man who carried himself with quiet authority, his words few but deliberate. There was no pity in his eyes, only recognition. Rose tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering fiercely, "Mama, you can't keep worrying about their gossip. You've always told me work is what makes a person worthy, not words." Clara's chest tightened with emotion. Rose had listened, truly listened, to the lessons she had fought to instill. She drew in a deep breath and looked back at Hawk. "What would you have me do first?" A faint flicker of approval crossed his face. "Tomorrow morning, ride out to my place just north of the ridge. We'll set you to work. Pay will be ready by sundown." Clara nodded slowly. "Then I'll be there." Hawk tipped his hat, nothing more, and turned to go. His strides were purposeful, steady as the mountains themselves. As the evening shadows lengthened, Clara and Rose walked back toward their wagon. Rose's steps were light, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Mama, this is your chance. They'll see." "They'll have to see." Clara smiled faintly at her daughter's enthusiasm, though her own heart carried both hope and apprehension. She knew this work would not silence the town's whispers, but perhaps it would give her something greater, the chance to show her worth not in words but in deeds. The mountains loomed ahead, dark against the fading sky. Clara felt their pull, steady and inevitable, as though her path had always been leading there. Tomorrow, she would take her first step into that rugged wilderness, not as a victim of gossip, but as a woman who chose to stand firm. The morning sun crept over the ridge as Clara and Rose made their way toward Hawk Dawson's homestead. The path wound through thick stands of pine and aspen, the air crisp with the smell of sap and damp earth. Clara guided the mule cart with quiet determination, though inside, unease coiled tight. This was no small step. Working for Hawk meant stepping deeper into the wilderness and further into the scrutiny of Durango's wagging tongues. Rose sat beside her, eyes bright with excitement. "Mama, they'll have to respect you after this. You'll show them all." Clara gave a soft chuckle, though it carried a trace of doubt. "Respect doesn't come easy, Rose. Sometimes folks would sooner cling to their mockery than admit they were wrong." "But you'll change their minds," Rose insisted. "I know it." Hawk's cabin came into view, tucked against the tree line with smoke curling from the chimney. A corral held 2 sturdy horses, and rows of stacked firewood lined the side of the house with military precision. Abigail Dawson, Hawk's daughter, stood near the porch with a basket of kindling, her dark braid falling over one shoulder. She watched as Clara climbed down from the cart, her expression curious but not unkind. Hawk emerged from the barn, his voice carrying across the yard. "You came." Clara met his gaze, steady despite the flutter in her chest. "You offered honest work. I aim to keep my word." He nodded once, wasting no time. "Leather's inside, needs cutting and sewing. Woodpile's short too." "If you've got the back for it, there's an axe by the stump." Clara set her jaw. "Point me to the work." Hours passed beneath the brightening sky. Clara lifted the axe and brought it down with practiced precision, splitting logs clean in 2. Her shoulders burned, sweat dampened her brow, but each strike was steady, unyielding. Hawk's ranch hands gathered nearby to mend tack, exchanged glances at first, smirking at the sight of a woman swinging an axe. But their laughter faded as log after log fell neatly beneath her strength. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Rafe, muttered, "She's got more grit than half the men in town." Another whistled low. "Ain't no ordinary woman, that's for sure." Rose, perched on a stump, watched with glowing pride. Abigail joined her, setting the kindling basket aside. "Your mama's strong," she said quietly. Rose lifted her chin. "She's the strongest person I know." Inside the cabin later, Clara worked the hides. Her fingers, calloused from years of labor, moved with unexpected finesse as she stitched and shaped leather into usable gear. Hawk observed in silence, his keen eyes noting the steadiness of her hands, the patience in her work. By sundown, the yard was stacked high with split wood, the cabin filled with the smell of treated leather. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, weary but not broken. Hawk stepped forward, offering a small pouch of coins. "Fair pay for fair work," he said simply. Clara accepted it, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you." Rafe tipped his hat, a newfound respect in his gaze. "Ma'am, you put us all to shame today." Clara's lips curved faintly, though she said nothing. Words of praise were rare, and she would not cheapen them by answering lightly. As Rose climbed into the cart beside her mother, her voice was alive with excitement. "Did you see their faces, Mama? They know now. They saw what I've always seen." Clara held the reins, her heart swelling at her daughter's pride. Yet a quiet thought lingered. Proving herself once would not end the whispers. Respect was not a single day's labor. It was a battle to be fought again and again. The mountains loomed golden in the fading light as they rode home. Clara's muscles ached, but her spirit stood taller. She had taken the first step. Tomorrow she knew the test would only grow harder. The days stretched into weeks, and Clara's steady labor at Hawk Dawson's homestead began to ripple through Durango. Men who once laughed at her size now spoke in grudging respect of her ability to swing an axe longer than most, or to stitch a saddle without a flaw. Some even tipped their hats as she passed, though their admiration was always wrapped in caution, as if unsure whether it was proper to praise her openly. Not everyone welcomed her growing presence. In the heart of town, Vivian Miller watched with narrowed eyes from the polished windows of her saloon. The Golden Spur was her domain, a place of velvet drapes, polished mahogany, and hushed conversations that shaped much of Durango's opinion. Vivian thrived on influence, and Clara's rising reputation unsettled her careful balance. "She's turning heads," Vivian muttered one evening to her companion, a rancher who nursed his whiskey at the bar. "Not with beauty, not with grace, but with brute strength. It unsettles people, though they pretend otherwise." The rancher chuckled. "Unsettles you, you mean?" Vivian's eyes flashed. "I've worked too hard to build respect in this town. I won't have it stolen by a woman who swings an axe like a man and thinks herself better for it." Rumors began to spread, subtle at first, then louder. Whispers that Clara was taking work from men who needed wages, that she was unfeminine, that no decent household should welcome her. Some women repeated Vivian's words at the market, clucking their tongues. "She's trying to be something she's not." What man would marry such a creature? Clara heard the whispers. She felt the sting each time she walked past the saloon, and Vivian's sharp gaze followed her. Yet she kept her head high, determined to let her work speak louder than the poison in other mouths. One afternoon, as Clara unloaded firewood from her cart in front of the blacksmith's shop, a pair of women stopped nearby, their voices pitched just loud enough to carry. "Can't even let men do their jobs," one said. "What kind of woman chooses to sweat in the sun when she should be minding a home?" Rose, standing beside her mother, spun around, her eyes blazing. "My mama works because she has to. She doesn't need anyone's permission to be strong." The women sniffed and hurried off, their skirts swishing with disdain. Clara laid a steady hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Let them go, Rose. Their words don't fill bellies nor mend boots." "But it isn't fair," Rose muttered, her voice tight with anger. "They don't even know you." Clara's gaze softened. "Fairness is rare in this world. We live by what we know of ourselves, not by what others say." Yet the whispers gnawed at her, especially when work grew scarce. A merchant who once promised her steady sewing suddenly declined her services, muttering excuses about needing to keep business proper. Clara suspected Vivian's hand in it, her influence stretching further than most dared to challenge. At Hawk's homestead, Abigail noticed the weariness in Clara's eyes as they worked side by side. "They're turning against you, aren't they?" she asked quietly. Clara hesitated before answering. "Some of them. But I've weathered storms before. I'll weather this one too." Abigail gave a small nod, her expression thoughtful. "My father says strength isn't just muscle. It's standing steady when others try to push you down." Clara smiled faintly, the words warming her spirit. "Your father speaks truth." That evening, as Clara and Rose rode back into town, they passed the Golden Spur. Vivian stood at the entrance, her dress glittering under the lantern light, her smile sharp as a knife. She watched Clara with a look that held both challenge and promise. Clara met her gaze, her chin lifting just slightly. She would not bow to gossip, not now, not ever, but deep inside, she knew Vivian's rivalry was far from over. The county fair arrived with the first blush of autumn, the air crisp and tinged with the smell of roasted corn, fresh hay and the smoke of cook fires. Families streamed into Durango from nearby ranches, wagons creaking under the weight of produce, livestock and laughter. Banners fluttered above the main street, and children darted between booths where ribbons and pies promised prizes. For a moment, even Clara felt the hum of celebration ease the heaviness that had followed her in recent weeks. Rose tugged at her sleeve, her eyes wide with excitement. "Mama, look! They've set up the contests. There's a log-lifting trial and the shooting range and even horse races." Clara smiled faintly. "Fairs are for cheer, Rose. Let's enjoy what we can." But whispers stirred as soon as they entered the fairground. Women clutched their parasols tighter, men smirked behind their mustaches, and children pointed with innocent curiosity. Clara felt every eye measure her again, not for the first time. Vivian Miller stood near the judge's booth, her golden dress catching the sunlight, her lips curled in satisfaction as she watched the murmurs spread. "Word is she thinks herself stronger than men," Vivian said loudly to a group of townsfolk. "Let's see how far that pride carries her today." Rose's jaw tightened. "Mama, you can't let her win. You should enter the contests. Show them." Clara shook her head. "I didn't come here to prove anything. I came so we could have a day together." But fate had other plans. At the log-lifting contest, a brawny rancher struggled to raise the massive timber, sweat pouring down his face as the crowd cheered him on. When he finally dropped it with a thud, the announcer called for challengers. Silence followed until a voice rang out from the crowd. "She should try." All eyes turned to Clara. Laughter rippled through the onlookers, sharp and mocking. Rose stepped forward, her cheeks flushed. "She can do it. Stronger than any of you." Clara's heart pounded. She wanted to shield her daughter, to walk away, but Rose's unwavering gaze held her fast. Slowly, Clara stepped forward. "If it's strength you want tested, then let it be tested." The crowd parted with a mix of curiosity and scorn. Vivian's smile sharpened, certain Clara would fail. Hawk Dawson, standing near the edge with Abigail, crossed his arms but said nothing, his eyes watchful. Clara approached the timber. She planted her boots firmly in the dirt, bent her knees, and wrapped her arms around the thick wood. For a moment, silence fell. Then, with a steady exhale, she lifted. The log rose inch by inch, her muscles straining, her breath slow and deliberate. Gasps echoed through the crowd as she straightened her back and held it high. Children cheered, men muttered in disbelief, and Rose's voice soared above them all. "That's my mama!" Clara lowered the timber gently, her chest heaving but her spirit fierce. The announcer, stunned, declared her the winner. Murmurs swept through the crowd, some in admiration, others in disbelief, but respect glimmered in more than a few eyes. Vivian's smile faltered, though she clapped slowly, her gaze cold. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "perhaps strength has its place, but strength doesn't make a woman." Clara met her eyes, calm and steady. "No, but it makes me who I am." And that's enough. The crowd buzzed with talk as Clara stepped back to Rose, who wrapped her arms tightly around her waist. "You showed them, Mama. You showed them all." Clara kissed her daughter's hair softly. "We showed them, Rose. You and me, together." As the fair continued, Clara felt a shift in the air, not a full acceptance, but the beginning of something new. For the first time, whispers were mixed with words of admiration, and where ridicule had once lived, respect began to take root. In the days following the fair, Durango buzzed with talk of Clara May Johnson. The image of her lifting the log had etched itself into every conversation, traveling from the general store to the saloon and even into the quiet pews of the church. For some it was a story of shock, for others it was the beginning of reluctant admiration. Rose felt the shift most of all. Walking beside her mother through town, she noticed fewer sneers and more nods, cautious but genuine. A rancher even tipped his hat and said, "Fine work at the fair, ma'am," before hurrying along as though ashamed to be caught showing kindness. Rose's chest swelled with pride. Yet Clara remained measured. Respect earned in a single moment can vanish just as quick, she reminded her daughter. We must keep walking steady. At Hawk Dawson's homestead, the atmosphere carried less tension. His ranch hands no longer smirked when Clara swung the axe or stitched leather. Instead, they offered tools without being asked, working alongside her with an unspoken acknowledgement of her strength. Rafe, once the most skeptical, even chuckled one evening. "Truth be told, Mrs. Johnson, you work harder than the lot of us combined." Clara only smiled faintly. Praise was welcome, but it didn't change her purpose: to survive, to provide for Rose, and to stand firm against scorn. Rose, meanwhile, found a new friend in Abigail Dawson. The two girls spent afternoons roaming the edge of the woods, collecting berries or daring each other to climb the low pines. Their laughter carried across the yard, a sound that warmed Clara's heart more than any kind word from townsfolk. One evening, as the girls braided wildflowers into each other's hair, Abigail spoke softly. "People look at your mama and see someone different, but I look at her and see someone who could stand against a storm. My papa says that's the kind of strength that keeps folks alive." Rose grinned. "That's because he knows what's true. My mama's the strongest person in Durango, whether they admit it or not." Inside the cabin, Hawk sat sharpening his knife, while Clara worked to hide. The firelight flickered, casting shadows across his lined face. After a long silence, he spoke. "The fair changed things. Some of the men respect you now. They don't say it loud, but it's there." Clara didn't look up from her stitching. "Respect built on spectacle won't last. They'll wait for me to falter so they can laugh again." Hawk studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Maybe. But you held that log longer than most men could have dreamed. Folks remember strength when it saves them, not when it entertains." Her eyes lifted then, catching his. There was no mockery, no pity, only steady recognition. It stirred something inside her, a reminder that not all judgment was cruel. As they left Hawk's that evening, the sky stretched wide and star-filled. Rose leaned against her mother on the wagon seat, drowsy from the day's laughter. "Mama," she murmured, "don't you feel it? Things are changing. They're starting to see." Clara brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Perhaps they are, but even if they don't, you see me, and that's enough." Rose smiled sleepily. "I always will." The mule plodded on, the creak of the wagon blending with the chorus of crickets. Clara looked out across the moonlit fields, her heart steadier than it had been in weeks. For the first time since arriving in Durango, she felt the faint beginnings of belonging, not from the town's approval, but from the quiet bonds growing stronger around her. Yet deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning. Respect could blossom, but it could also wither under pressure, and Durango had a way of testing anyone who dared to stand apart. Autumn deepened, painting the aspens gold and sending crisp winds sweeping through Durango. Clara continued her work at Hawk's homestead and took in sewing jobs where she could, her hands always busy, her spirit quietly firm. The fair had given her a sliver of respect, but whispers still clung in corners, sharpened by envy. And no envy burned brighter than Vivian Miller's. Vivian had built her life on power, woven not through labor but through influence. She listened carefully to every word in her saloon, gathering gossip the way others gathered coin. And lately, too many of those words were about Clara. "She's useful," a rancher admitted over whiskey. "Works harder than my men." Vivian's smile tightened. "And you pay her for it. A woman taking work from honest ranch hands. How long before she steals your place entirely?" The rancher frowned, uncertain. Vivian leaned closer, her voice soft as silk. "Mark me. Durango's strength is in men who know their place, and women who keep theirs. You let her step over that line, and soon the whole town will suffer." Her poison worked quickly. By the week's end, Clara found doors that had once been open now closed. The merchant, who had begged her for leather repairs, suddenly claimed he had no need. The seamstress, who occasionally passed along extra work, now turned cold, saying, "It isn't fitting, a woman like you doing men's tasks." Rose noticed first. "Mama, they're avoiding you. It's not fair." Clara pressed her lips together, hiding her own frustration. Fairness is rare, child. What matters is that we endure. But endurance grew heavy when coin grew scarce. One afternoon, Clara approached the feed store, hoping to sell patched harnesses. The owner, Mr. Talbot, shook his head before she even spoke. "Mrs. Johnson, I can't take these. Folks are talking. They say you're not right for this line of work, that it ain't proper." Clara held his gaze. "Not proper to mend what's broken. Not proper to earn a living for my daughter." Talbot shifted uncomfortably. "It ain't me, ma'am. It's the town. Word spreads. Best you look elsewhere." She walked out with the harnesses still in her hands, her chest tight. Rose stormed beside her. "This is Vivian, isn't it? She's the one poisoning them against you." Clara sighed. "Likely so. But let her speak. Gossip is a fire, burns hot, but it leaves only ash." Yet in the quiet of night, Clara felt the weight pressing in. She had begun to hope, after the fair, that things were changing. Now the old scorn had returned, sharper than ever. At Hawk's homestead, she worked silently, her axe splitting wood with precise strikes. Hawk watched, sensing the shift in her demeanor. "They're turning their backs," he said flatly. Clara didn't answer. He set down the bridle he was repairing and met her eyes. "Vivian's stirring the pot. She thrives on making others smaller so she can stand taller. Don't let her win." Clara drew in a steady breath. Easy words, harder to live by. Hawk's gaze didn't waver. "Then live by your strength, same as always. You'll outlast her." "Folks can't eat gossip, but they can't live without the kind of work you do." Rose, standing nearby with Abigail, lifted her chin defiantly. "We'll prove it, Mama. They'll see one day." Clara managed a small smile for her daughter's sake, but inside, doubt gnawed at her. How many times could she prove herself before the world decided to see? The wind swept through the trees, scattering golden leaves across the yard. Clara knew one thing. Vivian Miller had declared war in whispers, and whispers had the power to strangle a reputation before a person could even draw breath to defend it. The chill of late autumn settled over Durango, mornings crisp with frost that glittered on the rooftops. Clara walked the main street with Rose at her side, her shawl pulled tight against the cold. She carried herself tall, but the sting of shuttered doors and quiet refusals lingered heavy in her chest. She had weathered storms before, but never one that spread so slyly, leaving her dignity questioned at every turn. It was on one such morning that Sheriff McGraw stopped her outside the post office. His badge gleamed in the pale sunlight, and his eyes, usually genial, carried a trace of discomfort. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, shifting his weight, "I'd like a word, if you've got a moment." Clara nodded warily. "Of course, Sheriff." He tipped his hat toward Rose. "Why don't you head over to the bakery, miss?" "I'll see your mama joins you shortly." Rose's lips pressed into a line, reluctant to leave, but Clara gave her a small nod. "Go on, Rose. I'll be right along." When Rose was out of earshot, McGraw cleared his throat. "I've had more than a few complaints come across my desk. Folks are saying your presence here is unsettling." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. "Unsettling how?" "Some claim you're taking work from men who need it. Others say you stir unrest, that your size and strength make you—" He faltered, then finished awkwardly. "Make you stand out too much. Not what Durango needs right now." Clara's chest tightened. "So the complaint is that I work hard, that I refuse to starve so others can feel comfortable." McGraw shifted, clearly uneasy. "Now, don't mistake me. I've got no quarrel with you, but this town, it runs on balance, and when one person tips that balance, trouble follows. I'm asking you, for your sake and your girls', maybe consider moving on." The words struck like a blow. Clara steadied herself, forcing calm into her voice. "Sheriff, I buried a husband on the trail. I hauled my daughter across miles of dust and hunger. We've come here to live, not to drift like tumbleweeds. If this town wants balance, then let it balance itself without asking us to disappear." A voice cut in from across the street, firm and unwavering. "She's right." Hawk Dawson strode forward, his broad frame commanding attention even before he spoke again. You know as well as I do, McGraw, that Clara's done more honest work than half the men in this town combined. She's no threat to Durango, she's a damn asset. The sheriff's jaw tightened. Hawk, this isn't your affair. It is, if you're telling a woman she don't belong because she's stronger than folks are comfortable with, Hawk replied evenly. His gaze was sharp, daring contradiction. A few townsfolk had paused nearby, drawn by the raised voices. Murmurs rippled among them, some siding with the sheriff, others whispering in agreement with Hawk. Clara stood tall, her hands steady, though her pulse thundered. McGraw exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping slightly. I don't want trouble here. Not from you, Hawk, and not from her. Then don't make trouble where there isn't any, Hawk said. Clara met the sheriff's gaze. We're not leaving, Sheriff. Not unless the good Lord himself tells us to. Durango can take us as we are, or not at all. For a moment silence hung heavy. Finally McGraw gave a curt nod. Very well. But mark me, Mrs. Johnson, the more you stand out, the harder it'll be to stand tall when the wind blows. He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Clara and Hawk in the street. Rose hurried back to her mother's side, her eyes wide. What did he say? Clara's voice was calm, but her resolve burned stronger than ever. He told us to move on, and I told him no. Rose's small hand slipped into hers, gripping tight. Hawk stood nearby, his expression unreadable, though his presence alone steadied the air. Clara knew the challenge was far from over, but she would not bend. Winter winds swept down from the mountains, rattling the windows of Durango and driving townsfolk indoors. Yet Clara May Johnson felt a different storm rising, one not of weather but of judgment. The sheriff's warning still echoed in her mind, and whispers trailed her more sharply than ever. Some claimed she defied the order of things, others that she sought to shame the men of the town. Each word pressed heavier, until Clara knew silence would no longer do. On a Sunday morning after the church service ended, she made her choice. As families poured from the small chapel, their voices a mix of gossip and pleasantries, Clara stepped onto the front steps. The cold bit through her shawl, but her heart burned with fire. Rose stood at her side, gripping her hand tightly. Clara's voice rose steady, strong enough to halt conversations. I've heard your words. I've felt your eyes on me since the day I set foot in this town. And I will not carry this weight in silence any longer. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Vivian Miller stood near the edge, her smile sharp, certain Clara would falter. Clara lifted her chin. You mock me for my size, for the work I do, for the strength I carry. You call me unnatural, unfeminine, unworthy. But what you see is not shame, it is survival. Every pound of strength you scorn has been earned by years of toil, by carrying water when no one else would, by ploughing soil so my child could eat, by burying a husband and still pressing forward. Her voice broke slightly, but she pressed on. I have walked miles with blistered feet, chopped wood till my hands bled, and lifted burdens that would have crushed others. And I will not apologize for it. I stand here not as less of a woman, but as one who has endured. The crowd shifted uneasily, faces turning toward one another. Some looked away, ashamed. Others hardened, unwilling to bend. Clara's gaze swept them all. You measure a woman by how small she is, how quiet she can be, how well she fits into the corner you've built for her. But I will not shrink to suit your comfort. I will not be quiet to soothe your pride. I came here to live, to give my daughter a future, and I will not move on simply because my presence unsettles you. Rose's voice rang out then, fierce and clear. That's my mama, and she's worth more than all your whispers put together. Her words cracked the air like a whip. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, not from weakness but from pride so fierce it ached. She squeezed Rose's hand, drawing strength from her daughter's defiance. Pastor Edwards, who had lingered near the steps, spoke next. His tone was solemn but firm. The good book says a tree is known by its fruit. And I have seen the fruit of this woman's labor, a daughter who honors her, a strength that serves others, and a life lived without deceit. Who among us can say we've done more? A hush fell. The words struck deeper than Clara's own, for they carried the weight of Scripture. Vivian's smile faltered. her eyes narrowing as the tide threatened to turn. Clara's chest rose and fell, her spirit raw but unbroken. She looked upon the crowd one final time. "Say what you will, but I will not leave. I will stand, I will work, and I will live, and no whisper will change that." The silence that followed was not entirely hostile. Somewhere in the stillness something shifted, a recognition, however reluctant, that her strength was not shameful but undeniable. As Clara stepped down from the church steps, Rose's small hand still in hers, she knew she had crossed a line that could never be undone. She had spoken truth into the open air, and though storms would still come, she would no longer meet them in silence. Spring came early that year, loosening the grip of winter with sudden warmth. Snowmelt rushed down the mountainsides, feeding creeks that swelled beyond their banks. At first, it was a welcome change, the sound of running water carrying promise of new life. But as the days passed, the current grew fiercer. Rain clouds gathered and whispers spread through Durango. The river was rising too fast. On a grey morning, Clara stood at the edge of town, staring at the water that churned against its banks, frothing and angry. Rose clutched her sleeve. "Mama, it's higher than yesterday." Clara's jaw tightened. "Aye, and if it keeps rising, it'll find its way through the streets." By afternoon, the river had broken loose, surging into the lower end of town. Shouts filled the air as townsfolk scrambled to move wagons and animals to higher ground. Children cried, women clutched belongings, and men strained to lift barrels and crates out of the water's reach. Clara wasted no time. She waded in without hesitation, her skirts heavy with the pull of the current, her arms steady as she hauled a sack of grain twice the size of what most men could carry. "Rose, stay close to Abigail," she called, her voice fierce. "Help where you can, but don't you dare step too deep." Hawk appeared through the chaos, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his boots already soaked. He met Clara's eyes with a quick nod. "We'll need every hand. Water's coming faster than we can move." Together they worked side by side. Hawk secured ropes across the rushing water, while Clara hauled children from wagons, her arms straining but unyielding. When a horse panicked, nearly dragging a young boy under, Clara seized the reins, planting her boots deep in the mud until the animal stilled. Gasps echoed from the townsfolk who watched, their disbelief giving way to awe. Vivian Miller, her golden dress soaked and muddied, shouted orders from the saloon steps, but her voice carried little weight as panic overtook her patrons. Clara, meanwhile, lifted a fallen beam from the doorway of a flooded home, pulling a trapped family to safety. Rose stood nearby, her face pale but her voice strong as she called encouragement to others. "Follow my mama. She knows what to do." Hours dragged on as the storm hammered the town, rain slashing through the air. Clara's muscles screamed, but she pressed forward, ferrying baskets of food, lifting sodden furniture, carrying those too weak to walk. Each task pushed her body beyond its limits, yet she refused to falter. At last, as dusk settled under a sky still swollen with clouds, the worst of the water began to recede. Townsfolk collapsed in exhaustion, their belongings scattered, but their lives spared. Clara stood knee-deep in the muddy street, her chest heaving, her dress torn, her hands raw and blistered. Rose rushed to her, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You saved them, Mama." "You saved everyone." Clara brushed wet hair from her daughter's face, her breath ragged. "No, child, we all saved each other." But even as she spoke, she felt the eyes upon her, men and women alike, their gazes no longer mocking, but humbled. They had seen her strength not as a spectacle, not as something unnatural, but as salvation. Hawk approached, his face lined with fatigue but steady with respect. "Durango owes you, Clara May," he said quietly. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." For the first time since she had arrived in this town, Clara felt not the sting of ridicule, but the weight of gratitude. And it was heavier than any log she had ever lifted. The flood had scarred Durango, but it had also washed something clean. The days following the flood were filled with quiet restoration. The waters had receded, leaving behind muddied streets and broken fences, but also a strange sense of unity among the people of Durango. Clara May Johnson, who had once been the subject of ridicule, had become the unspoken pillar of the town. At the local inn, men who had once avoided her now nodded with respect as she entered. The merchants, who had shut their doors to her before, now offered a courteous greeting. Even Vivian Miller, though still with a sharp edge, greeted her with a cool politeness that hinted at grudging respect. It wasn't just the work she had done during the flood that had shifted perceptions. It was the quiet strength she had shown, carrying, lifting, leading, and the way she had put herself at the center of the community when it mattered most. No longer was she the mountain in skirts or the mule woman. Clara May Johnson had become a force to reckon with. Rose noticed the change too. At the general store, the grocer no longer muttered complaints when Clara bought supplies. Instead, he gave her a knowing smile and slipped an extra bundle of firewood into her cart without charging. Clara didn't ask for these small acts of kindness, but they were becoming more frequent. It seemed the town had begun to realize that she wasn't just surviving. She was building something real here, something that wasn't just based on strength, but on her ability to stand her ground, even when no one else would. Hawk Dawson came by the cabin one afternoon, after the last of the flood damage had been cleared, his usual quiet expression replaced with something almost like satisfaction. "You've earned something, Clara," he said, handing her a small pouch of coin. "Folks have noticed, not just in the work you've done, but in the way you carry yourself now. You've got a new place here, more than just a widow with a strong back." Clara accepted the pouch, her fingers brushing his. There was a deep understanding between them, a recognition of the struggle they had both endured to carve out a life where none seemed possible. "I didn't do it for them," she said softly. "I did it for Rose, for us." "I know," Hawk replied, his gaze steady. "But sometimes the world changes when we stop asking for it and start showing them what we're made of." That evening, after Hawk left, Clara sat at the table with Rose. The room was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire. The faintest flicker of light danced across their faces as they spoke. "Do you feel it, Mama?" Rose asked, her voice hesitant but full of a hope Clara hadn't heard in a long time. "Do you think things are really different now?" Clara met her daughter's eyes, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. "I do, Rose. I think they're finally starting to see us, not as strangers or outcasts, but as part of this place." Rose smiled, a bright, unguarded smile. "I told you they'd see. I told you they would." As they ate their dinner by the fire, Clara reflected on the days that had led to this moment, the hardships, the mockery, the isolation, and how in the end they had shaped her. She had not been broken, not bent to the weight of others' opinions. Instead, she had forged her place through action, through strength, and through the relentless will to protect what mattered most. Durango was changing, and so was she. It wasn't just about fitting in anymore. It was about owning her space, her worth, and the future she would build for Rose. The town might never completely understand her, but Clara had learned that was no longer her concern. As the fire burned low, Clara leaned back in her chair. The warmth of the flames and the peaceful presence of her daughter, enough to quiet the worries still tugging at her heart. They had survived, together, and that was more than enough. The sun dipped low over Durango, casting long shadows across the streets. Clara stood at the edge of the porch, looking out at the town that had both challenged and shaped her. The winds had softened, the mountain peaks that framed the horizon still capped with the last remnants of snow. But Clara's heart felt warmer than it had in years. It had been a long journey to get here, to this place where the mocking stares had become nods of respect, and where the whispers were no longer about her size or strength, but about her role in the town, her contribution. Durango had changed, yes, but so had she. Clara's eyes softened as she watched Rose laugh with Abigail, the two girls running through the yard, their voices high with joy. They had weathered every storm, fought against every sneer, and now they were finding their place in this world they had fought so hard to claim. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar figure stepping onto the porch, his silhouette strong against the setting sun. Hawk Dawson. His presence was a quiet comfort, as constant as the mountains themselves. He had been a steady force in her life, someone who had respected her from the beginning, not for the size of her muscles or the weight of her burdens, but for the strength of her character. Thought I'd find you here, Hawk said, his voice low but steady. Durango's a different place now, Clara. You've carved out a space for yourself, and for Rose. Clara turned to face him, her gaze searching his. There was something in his eyes, something more than just friendship, something she had avoided seeing for so long. I didn't do it alone, she replied, her voice soft but unwavering. We've both fought for this. You've helped me more than I can say. Hawk stepped closer, his hand brushing against hers, a touch so small yet filled with meaning. I know, he said simply, his eyes never leaving hers. But it's you who's shown the town what true strength is, not just the kind in your arms, but the kind in your heart. Clara felt the weight of his words settle deep inside her. She had fought for survival, for respect, but now, in this moment, she realized that perhaps the greatest fight was the one for herself. I've learned a lot from you, she said quietly. From the way you carry yourself, the way you live without apology. I've spent so long trying to prove I belong that I forgot to just live. Hawk's smile was slow, but it reached his eyes. You've earned your place here, Clara. No one can take that away from you. As the night settled around them, Clara felt a deep peace settle in her chest. The years of hardship, the battles fought against prejudice and isolation, had led her here, not just to a place in Durango, but to a place within herself. She turned her gaze back to Rose, who was now walking toward her, a smile bright enough to light up the evening. Mama, I think they're finally starting to see us, Rose said, her voice full of the quiet confidence Clara had always hoped for her. Clara reached out, pulling her daughter close, holding her tight as if the strength of that embrace could hold back all the struggles of the past. They see us, Clara whispered, her heart full. And that's enough. The two of them stood there together, side by side, looking out at the town they had come to call home. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but Clara no longer feared them. For the first time in a long time, she felt certain of one thing. She had found her place not just in Durango but in the world. And it was a place she would stand in, firmly for as long as she could.